Really excited and looking forward to this morning of discussion about water and the economy. I think maybe I will quick go over the day's program and then give you a little housekeeping before getting going. So you've got the agenda in your packets. I'm going to start out with a little bit of an overview of our presentation of our report, and then we're going to move into panel mode where we're going to have some of the authors of the report and a distinguished group of folks from the water industry, from government, and from the business sector talk about some of the priority actions that we outline and kind of hopefully take it further than where we go in the report and generate some good food for thought. We're going to have one break in between the first panel and the second, and just related to that, housekeeping, the restrooms are up the stairs and over to it'll be to your left as you're walking up. You can see there's coffee and tea to keep you motored during the morning. And then after the last panel, we're going to break for lunch, and that's going to be the end of the sort of formal presentations and discussion, but we really hope that you stay around, enjoy lunch, and talk about water, hopefully. And we're going to try to have the panelists and the authors that are here sort of spread out a little bit to talk with you. So don't be shy to come and grab them. Other logistics, if everybody could please silence their cell phones. And there's an evaluation survey in your packet, which we would love it if you could fill out, because that helps us to figure out how to do these better in the future. And you can just drop them at the registration desk on the way out. And one last piece of logistics, which is that it's election day. So I was going to say vote early and often, but if you haven't voted this morning already, you can't vote early. But anyway, the polls are open until 8, so remember to vote. And I think with that, I'm going to get going. So this is, there we go. There's the slide. So water in the California economy. This is a study that was done by a large cast of folks I'm going to show you in a minute, and we would not have been able to do this without the support of the S.D. Bechtel Jr. Foundation. I think we have Joya Banerjee in the room somewhere, one of the program officers who supports the Water and Environment Program. And the Bechtel Foundation has been really fantastic in supporting not only our work, but the work of actually many of the researchers that have been involved in this project, and really helping us as Californians to look at various key issues in the water sector and in the environment sector, and how to get better knowledge about how to manage things. So we appreciate that very much. And now I'm going to introduce the authors. So those of you who are familiar with past PPIC work know that we've been kind of progressing. Back when I first started at PPIC, I would do reports by myself, and then maybe there would be one or two more people. Then we had a big report on the Delta with 6 authors, then 7, then 8, and now we've doubled it this time. We have 15 authors of this report. This was a special kind of exercise where a group of us, and it's some researchers, some folks from the finance sector, combining skills in economics, in engineering, in law, and in sort of the business angle of things, to look at the role of water in the economy. I'll introduce them really quickly. Bo Cutter from Pomona College, Katrina Gesso from UC Davis. You're going to hear from her later on this morning. Dan Sumner from UC Davis, Brian Gray from UC Hastings, Gary Leibkap from UC Santa Barbara, Dave Sunding from Berkeley, myself, Jay Lund from UC Davis, Brian Thomas from Public Financial Management, which is one of our finance experts, Dave Houston from Citigroup Global Markets. You're going to hear from Dave a bit later. Josue Medina Zuara from UC Davis, Buzz Thompson from Stanford, Richard Howitt from UC Davis. You'll also hear from him. And Sheila Olmstead from Resources for the Future, which is a think tank based in Washington, D.C., and Bob Wilkinson from Santa Barbara. So how did we do this? We got together in the fall for a one-day workshop to really just kind of hash through the issues and pretty much following the organization that you see laid out in the report, looking at what's water's role in California's economy now and in the foreseeable future, what are some of the key ways in which the water system makes the economy vulnerable, and then what are some priorities for action really in relation to those challenges and those vulnerabilities. And we were really amazingly, pleasantly surprised that in the course of this day where we talked about available data and research, we were able to come to a pretty strong consensus among the group. And so that's what's reflected in this document. Then we had a drafting team kind of iterate the draft with everybody else on the, in the group, and the product that you've got in front of you is that. So I'm going to now just kind of walk you through kind of key highlights from the report. So water's role in the economy, start with that. And I think it's useful in thinking about that to just have these maps in mind as sort of the legacy that we got from both from nature and from the investments that were undertaken in the 20th century. The very colorful map to the, I always get dyslexic left and right, to your left, thank you. That shows you the distribution of runoff relative to land area, and basically dark blue is lots of water and red is no water. And you can kind of see that a lot of our population centers, all of the sort of big Southern California population centers, Bay Area, and a lot of our major farming centers, including the San Joaquin Valley, sort of going from Stockton down to Bakersfield, and then the Imperial Valley down by El Centro, those are places that don't have a lot of natural runoff. They're good places to live and good places to farm for other reasons, but one of the things that was done back in the 20th century was a lot of infrastructure was built. Now, partly to move water to these places, and also partly to manage the variability that we have in our climate. We pretty much know, except for days like yesterday, that it's not going to rain between June and September, and that's the prime agricultural season. So we need to store water for the summers, but we also know that we've got a variable climate where it rains a lot some years and it doesn't rain very much some other years. We also have flooding susceptibility. So this map on the right-hand side shows you various kinds of major infrastructure that was built, and the triangles are reservoirs, and the lines are conveyance infrastructure, and anything that's not blue is not something that nature put there. That's something that was built. And this system allows us to live and farm where we do. It also does a lot to make water available at times that are most suited for human uses. It's done an okay job of flood protection. It mainly was done by the late 60s, early 70s. And there's a lot, you often hear discussions about how, well, because we stopped building this kind of stuff and the population has kept growing, that's been really bad for the economy. So wanted to just kind of dispel that myth by showing you some things that have changed since the late 60s. So not just in water, cars, information technology. I don't know what the capacity is of that big room. It might be smaller than the same. Yeah. Fashion. Fashion, maybe not. I don't know. And then water management. And so this is a graph that shows you a few key ratios. And when we put this together, we were kind of amazed at how the numbers line up. So water use per capita, and this is sort of in normal years or normalized years, so it's kind of taking out the variability from extreme dry years and extreme wet years. Water use per capita over all residences and businesses is half as high as it was in 1967. State GDP per capita, that's the red line, is twice as high. And state GDP per unit of water use is 4 times as high as it was in the late 60s, which means basically that we are using water in a more economically productive way over time. And that's true within agriculture, where I'm going to show you the next slide. Water use has actually gone down. This is total human-wide water use, applied water use in the agricultural sector and in the urban sector, which includes residents and non-farm businesses. You can see that ag water use looks like it probably peaked in about 1980, in the early 80s, and yet revenues and profits have continued to go up because of productivity increases and more efficient uses. And in the urban sector, for a while, population growth and water use were going up, and actually per capita use was going up. But since about the early 90s, mid-90s, we've actually made a lot of efforts, successful efforts on water use efficiency in the urban sector as well. And so actually, even despite population growth now, water use in the urban sector seems to be flattening off. So we may actually be at a point where instead of thinking about population growth leading to ever-increasing demands for water, that we may have kind of gotten to the point where that's somewhat leveled off. Now, we expect, as a group, looking at the data and evidence, that these trends are likely to continue. Agriculture is expected to be using less land and less water and producing ever more productive and higher value crops. The urban sector, we're expecting continued efficiency gains. And the environment, and this is another point that I haven't raised yet, environmental water demand and the demand for healthy watersheds has really also been a trend since the late 60s that we've seen really increasing in a lot of different ways and reflected in a lot of different ways. And that we're expecting that there's going to be continued demand growth for that. And that's part of sort of a societal shift in recognition that that's an important part of what makes California a good place to live. It's something actually that's hard to measure in economic terms, but it's definitely something that does support the economy in the sense of making California a good place also to, because it's a good place to live and work, it's a good place for businesses to attract productive workforce. So it's not just about environment for environment's sake, it's also an important part of the economy. And that's just a picture of Mono Lake, one of the early places where some water was put back into the environment because it was recognized that too much was being taken out of the system. So key vulnerabilities. Some of them are what you'd expect, some of them are not. I'm going to start with one that is not as much a vulnerability as people often think, and that's drought. When there's a drought, we hear about it a lot in the media that it's going to be a disaster for the economy, and it turns out that California's economy is pretty used to weathering droughts, and that's partly because we've been having this variable climate all along, and so there are a certain number of tools that we've just kind of got to manage that, including, grab my water, including the storage reservoirs that we put in place. We've also been increasingly diversifying our portfolio to be able to do that more. And there's a list here of some of the different kinds of tools: water use efficiency, water markets, groundwater storage, which is something that's become much more active now, groundwater banking it's often called, recycling wastewater and using that, capturing stormwater is something sort of on the new frontier. So that's all been helping us to manage. This is a cartoon from the drought in the late 80s, early 90s. You can kind of see the journalistic approach to how bad droughts are, and that was definitely a bad drought, but we got through it fine thanks to expanding some of these tools. Now, it's clear that agriculture is the most vulnerable sector when it comes to droughts, and there can be some local dislocations, local problems that really make can really impact and hit hard in some regions of the state with a drought. But it's also important to recognize that agriculture is a pretty small share of California's economy now. It's about 1 to 2% of GDP, depending on whether you count agriculture-related manufacturing in there or not. So we're suggesting that these same tools are going to help California adapt to the anticipated impacts on the water supply of a changing climate. And what this map shows you is one of the things that there's probably the most agreement on among the various models, which is that with warming temperatures, we're going to lose a lot of our snowpack. And so this is just one of the results of one of those models. Basically, blue is snow. This is Sierras. Red is not snow. This particular model projects that by the end of the century, we may have lost half of it. Some models, depending on how high the temperatures get, could be even higher than that. That means less free storage. We store a lot of our summer water in the snowpack. It's unclear yet whether there'll be also less average precipitation. That's something that the models do not kind of converge on. But there has been analysis looking at that, and even with a warmer, drier climate, it looks like agriculture can continue to do well. This is a scenario for 2050, assuming a warmer, drier climate. The green is what would happen in that case versus the sort of business as usual with historical climate in the yellow. So irrigated acreage and farm water use would likely go down quite a bit, but farm revenues would still, real farm revenues and profits would still increase, although maybe not as much as with the historical climate. So where is the economy more vulnerable? we're highlighting basically some of the other aspects of California's natural conditions that make us vulnerable, and that's earthquakes, floods, and the possibility of major interruptions to our supply system. And the delta is the big one there. This is a map of the delta that shows you how much land is under sea level, everything that's not green in that map. We bring a lot of water from the Sacramento River and its tributaries down to the Southern California, San Joaquin Valley, western, the Bay Area, right through those levees. And those levees are fragile and susceptible to major damage with earthquakes that could shut down the system. Also, there's a sort of perennial issue with how to manage that ecosystem in a way that is balancing the economic and environmental objectives, because right now the native fish in the delta are not doing well. It's also the case, and we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that other places besides the delta are vulnerable. There are a lot of local systems that also could be shut down with earthquakes and in some cases with floods, and we need to look at that. Now the issues here are both short-term costs. If you have a sort of catastrophic interruption, you can have some really high short-term costs to a local economy or to a statewide economy in the case of the delta outage, but also the potential for reduced investments over the long term if we're not kind of getting a handle on reliability of our supplies. And that does not mean we have to be 100% sure of how much we're going to get out of any system. That's not going to be possible in California's climate, but some notion of sort of what's the baseline that we can expect is important for thinking about, businesses need to have an idea of that in order to be able to make investments. Catastrophic flood risk is another area that we highlight. This is especially important in a place like the Sacramento area, but also in the Bay Area and also along California's ocean coastline. This is likely to get worse with sea level rise and the warming that's projected. And basically, even though California strengthened some of its targets for flood protection, we're not really at a point yet where we can say that we're strong enough or going to be strong enough to protect against these major risks, both to human life and to property. Groundwater risks are high. This is something that's been in the news a lot lately because of a UC Davis study on nitrate contamination both in the Tulare Basin and sort of southern San Joaquin Valley and the Salinas Valley, Monterey. But there's also serious overdraft in both of these basins. And there's a problem of inadequate, incomplete management of groundwater in a lot of our agricultural areas still. Now, priorities for action. We identify 7. I'm going to run through them quickly, and we're going to talk about some of these in the panels. First one is modernizing measurement and pricing. Thinking about the water system as a business, we're not doing very well in that. And this is a little drawing that I think California's water measurement system is a little better than this, but there are some major holes and major ways in which we have to do educated guesstimates, and groundwater is one of those, where we do not have a groundwater reporting system that allows really accurate statewide estimates of how much groundwater we use, even though it's about 30% on average of water in the state. We're suggesting getting modern about this, using advanced technology, including satellite data, to help back out the measurements of groundwater use. This is something that other Western states are starting to do on a regular basis. And then on pricing, we're suggesting that we need to get better at pricing in a way that does not discourage consumers from conserving. So in this past drought, all of the urban agencies were asking people to reduce their water use. They did that, and then the agencies had to go back to them and say, okay, thank you very much. Now we're going to raise your rates, because they couldn't cover their costs. What needs to happen is having a drought pricing policy in place so that it's possible to raise rates in advance, saying, look, we're going to have a drought this year. We need you to conserve, but we also need to cover our costs, and this is the way we're going to do it. Reducing vulnerability to supply interruptions. We highlight the delta as one place where we've got to get clarity, whether it's a canal or a tunnel, or just kind of focusing more on local supplies. There are different kinds of options with different kinds of costs. It's important just to get to the point of making a decision now. Also, we have to address local infrastructure weaknesses, and we have to really be concerned with collaborating with developers on finding water for growth, because this is a key area where we're going to start seeing, when the housing picture starts to pick up again, that there are going to be regions of the state where it's not going to be straightforward to be able to show that you've got long-term water supply right now with the uncertainties that we've got about the delta and other issues. Water marketing and banking both need to be strengthened. Water market was a key to getting us out of the camel situation, the 1991 drought. This data, which is shown in the report, looks at what the trends have been in water marketing over time. We've made a lot of progress in the 90s, and then since the early 2000s, it's been leveling off, even though we faced a big drought at the end of the 2000s. The sort of light gray is the dry years. And so we're suggesting reducing both infrastructure and institutional barriers to water markets and improving local groundwater management, which is important for its own sake, and it's also important to facilitate groundwater banking and storing water in groundwater banks. And one of the panels is going to talk about this more. Reducing flood risk exposure. Part of the solution, we think, is making sure incentives are clear for property owners. And also, the kind of investments that we do, we need to kind of be thinking about killing more than one bird with one stone. So part of that is making more room for rivers. Basically, instead of trying to have levees up close to the rivers and protecting just using concrete to protect us, also make more room for floodplains. And this is an example of a very old kind of investment like this, the Yolo Bypass, which is very effective at protecting Sacramento. There's opportunities for more of that. Improving the effectiveness of environmental management. There's a lot of benefit of environmental management for the economy, of the environment for the economy. Healthy watersheds support the economy, but we haven't been very successful at one key issue, which is protecting native species and sort of aquatic ecosystems. And this graph shows you basically what's been happening to native fish over time since the late 80s. The green, that's the important take on there. The green is the share that's in good shape. So less than 20% of our native fish are in good shape. So the trends are not good, even though we've been putting a lot of effort and regulation and money into trying to fix this problem. So we're suggesting that we really need to shift to a more integrated approach to this, more coordinated, less piecemeal. And we have some thoughts for that in the report. Funding. The last panel is going to talk about this. We need to develop more sustainable funding in some key areas. In the report, we provide estimates of how much money is spent in the water sector. It's a lot. And we're suggesting that for water supply infrastructure and for wastewater infrastructure, which you can see are the big ticket items, those are mainly paid by ratepayers, and they're okay. That doesn't mean everything's great, but they're relatively sound in terms of doing the kind of investments that are needed over time to keep the system going. Costs are going to be going up there, but there's a basis for communicating with ratepayers and raising the funds necessary. The failing marks go to flood management infrastructure, ecosystem management, and then a tiny area which is state planning and oversight. Flood management infrastructure, our funding system is kind of outdated. It depends on a lot of federal money that's not coming, and so we've got to figure out a better way to do this because we're way behind. In ecosystem management, this dollar figure just refers to what's spent by the regulatory agencies. Clearly, there's a lot of other spending that goes on across the other areas of water management. This is failing in part because it's based on unreliable money. It's been really funded by general obligation bonds, mostly, a bit by ratepayers, and it's basically too sporadic and kind of stop and start and not kind of looking at things in a comprehensive way. And then state planning and oversight with the state budget problems, it's hard. I showed you the model of how we collect water information. Part of the hard thing there is just not having the dedicated resources to do that. So looking ahead, just going to wrap up. There's been a lot of talk about whether or not we're going to have another water bond. As part of a historic package in 2009, the legislature put an $11 billion bond on the ballot. That was to have been on the November 2010 ballot. It was pushed forward to November of this year. It may be pushed forward again. Just with the hard economic times, the voters are no longer seeming as obviously happy with the idea of voting for general obligation bonds. And this graph shows you over time that the dark green is bonds that pass. We passed a lot of money in the 2000s to support water. In real terms, nearly $25 billion in recent dollars. If we're lucky, we'll get half of that with this bond that's on the ballot, and but it's not at all clear. So it really raises questions about where we go from here, even though, clearly bonds can do some good things, and they've been important both for floods and for the environment especially. And then I'll close on an optimistic note. We're sort of arguing that it's really going to be important for business leaders and others to promote water reform, and just because basically the local water agencies and the regional water agencies have been doing a lot of good things. That's why we're not in the kind of economic trouble that we might be with the system that we've got. State leaders are going to need to really help direct what we do on some of these key challenges, but they don't make policy in a vacuum, and it's important for stakeholders of all stripes, and including the business community, to step up to the plate. And this is an example of something recent that I think is a great example of the kind of thing that we're going to need. Back in April, there was an announcement of a new public-private partnership in the Bay Area to address environmental issues in the South San Francisco Bay, and the extreme flood risks in Silicon Valley. What this map shows you, the purple is areas that are in a 100-year floodplain already. The light pink is areas that are going to be underwater or below sea level by mid-century, according to some projections. And the dark red is sort of more it's the same thing, but for end of the century. And you can see the logos of all the major Silicon Valley companies. They're all there. And so this has kind of prompted an opportunity for the business community and public sector, public agencies and foundations to team up and say, we're going to figure out a way to raise the money to deal with this, and to do it in an economically and environmentally supportive way. And we think that this is the key sort of model for a lot of the kind of things that we need in other areas, in other parts of the state and in other areas too. So I think with that I'm going to stop.